Back in January, ride-hailing service Lyft agreed to settle a class action lawsuit by giving its drivers more than $12 million, as well as other benefits, including notifying drivers if they are going to be removed from the platform. However, drivers would still not be considered employees, but would remain independent contractors. So, Elliot, this past Friday, some court documents were released basically saying, with additional information given from Lyft, that if drivers over the past 4 years were actually considered employees as opposed to independent contractors, they would actually be entitled to $126 million as opposed to the $12 million lawsuit that they settled earlier in January. So the question here, though, is sort of, you know, according to the co-founder and CEO of Lyft, the question is whether or not it's more substantial for drivers to be considered independent contractors or employees. According to him, it's better for the drivers to be independent contractors. And he actually had this to say about it. He says, quote, "It should be understood that this is a specific industry where our average driver is doing 15 hours, and we're trying to create benefits for all drivers. We've thought about it from the perspective of all the drivers on the platform. We're trying to do what is the right legal path, and for us, that's quite clear." Sure. So to me, I want to know what you think about this, because I'm a little mixed. At the same time that I think, you know, people should be reimbursed for mileage, for example. They should maybe have some help when it comes to vehicle maintenance. But at the same time, the appeal of a company like this, Lyft or Uber, is that people get to work when they want to, and they don't have a boss telling them what their schedule is. So wouldn't it make sense for them to not be employees? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a gray area, but this kind of a decision is significant because it would completely decimate the industry, and the industry is this multi-billion-dollar industry that's been born of the internet, and it's been born of Uber was really the market leader, and Lyft is sort of trying to compete and doing so less successfully than Uber. But Uber had a similar situation with a class action lawsuit, and then December of last year they compelled all of their drivers to sign, their 400,000 plus drivers, to sign documentation saying that they agreed that they were independent contractors, they were not employees. The problem becomes, as we've seen, with things such as insurance, because that's, aside from the employee benefits, it then becomes into how you interact with your consumers and the customers and the passengers, ultimately. And so it then becomes one of liability and insurance. And if it was the case, I mean, it's untenable for these companies, if it was the case, to have 400,000 plus employees. They just would cease to operate, just financially and from a liability point of view. You talk about mileage reimbursement. The mileage reimbursement for an employee is 57.5 cents per mile.
Sure. Well,
you know, your profit margin goes out of the window. And I think, listen, I have sympathy with both sides of the argument. Ultimately, you know, you want to do what's right for the drivers and what is beneficial for them. But it is a less tenable argument if your average driver is doing 15 hours a week, to say that you're a direct employee. Exactly. But it then comes into, there's so many other factors come into play over and above just the number of hours that you can be a part-time employee. Sure. Just because you're only doing 15 hours a week doesn't mean you're not directly employed by the business. Right,
exactly.
Right. So it becomes a question of degrees. And then it comes a question of really about liability, and that's what they're seeking to absolve themselves of. And I do have an issue with that. If I'm driving, if I'm a passenger in an Uber car, the reason I'm going with an Uber rather than just some Joe off the street is because it's part of Uber. But under this law, it wouldn't matter, because if I get into a car crash or an incident, then I'm only really, my liabilities extends as far as the insurance of the driver. Uber doesn't want anything to do with it.
Sure. Like,
and I have a problem with that.
Yeah, like they're their own, technically they're considered their own business, right? Like they're picking up their own clients. That's
Correct.
The whole point. That's the idea behind it. But I mean, again, it is tricky, because if you, for example, if you kind of break down the $126 million that the drivers could be entitled to, that's broken down to $835 per driver, as opposed to what the settlement is now, which is about like $50 per person. The thing is, though, because there's so many drivers that work, I mean, some didn't even drive 60 hours over this 4-year period that we're talking about, so it doesn't make sense that they would be entitled to almost, you know, about $800 for mileage reimbursement. It's hard to find that line when you have people working so many different hours. And as a matter of fact, so Shannon Liss-Riordan, who's the lawyer on behalf of the plaintiff, she sort of agreed with that. So even during the settlement, while they had wished that the drivers would be considered employees or rebranded as employees. She did say this. She said, based on the data we reviewed, the vast majority of Lyft drivers have driven very little, even less than 30 hours total for the company, which is why the average amount per driver is so low. So this this settlement that was agreed upon in January, there is still some question. The judge who is deciding on whether or not to approve the settlement, he's the one that had asked for more information from Lyft just to get these numbers. So we will see how it works out. We'll decide if this judge sees whether or not Lyft will actually have to give a lift to its drivers.